Hey everybody, my name is Stan Christopoulos, and you're listening to Exploring Reality, where we attempt to show the rational side of the Christian faith and show that it's true. We are covering the moral argument in this series. This is the last video. The first video, the second video, and the third video were all covering what the argument was and defending its premises. In this video, we're going to be covering objections. So, as a recap, let's cover the premises and the conclusion of the argument, just in case you are just tuning in for the first time. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore God exists. With that, objections to this argument are pretty black and white. They're either really good or they're really bad. I've yet to see an in-between. So you'll see what I'm talking about as we go through these. With that, let's dive in. So the first two objections I'm going to cover are going to be the most popular ones and the most powerful ones at a first glance. So the first one is the Euthyphro Dilemma. Most skeptics will say the Euthyphro Dilemma proves that either God isn't necessary for objective morality or that morality isn't objective if it's God's arbitrary opinion. So people use this as an objection to both premises at the same time based on either horn of the dilemma. So before I go into overcoming the objection, I want to explain what the Euthyphro Dilemma is. The Euthyphro Dilemma is found in Plato's dialogue called Euthyphro, where Socrates asks Euthyphro this question: is the good loved by the gods because it is good, or is the good good because it is loved by the gods? So for context, Plato was an Athenian philosopher. Socrates was a Greek philosopher from Athens as well, who is credited as one of the founders of Western philosophy. And Euthyphro was a made-up character by Plato for the purpose of philosophical dialogue, to talk to himself, essentially. Back to the dilemma. The reason this is called a dilemma is because we're stuck between two choices. So one horn of the dilemma means that objective good would exist independently of the gods. The other horn of the dilemma means that morality, or good, is only good because of the god's arbitrary opinion, meaning it's subjective. So here is the problem when somebody presents the Euthyphro Dilemma as an objection to the moral argument. For a scenario to be a true dilemma, there has to be only two options. And that is why this is called a false dilemma. The reason it's a false dilemma is because while it presents two options that we can choose from, there's actually a third one. The third option itself is that God himself is the standard of good. Morality is objectively based off of his necessary, objective, unchanging nature. That nature being necessarily good. The necessarily good part is important because it means that in any possible world, by definition, then God would have to have the same exact nature. So the reason this matters so much is because inevitably the skeptic here is going to ask something along the lines of, so if God's nature was to torture babies, would that be considered good? He's presenting a different possible world there. The answer to that question is that it's a false question. It's like asking, is a square a circle? Because there is no possible world where a maximally great being like God would be anything other than who he is. So the concept of him having a different nature in a different world is incoherent because we're talking about a completely different being at that point. God is, by definition, maximally great. That means he cannot take on a different ontological meaning in different worlds. If I lost you here, this is the bird's eye view. God himself is the standard of good. He is the standard of right or wrong. And this can't be confused with him arbitrarily choosing what is good or referring to a standard beyond himself. Good itself is contingent on who God is because he is the standard, and without him there is no standard. This third option eliminates the dilemma, and God himself is what Immanuel Kant referred to as the summum bonum, which is what we referred to in the first video. So most skeptics here will still not accept this. And they'll try to charge me with something called special pleading. Special pleading is essentially this: an argument in which the speaker deliberately ignores aspects that are unfavorable to their point of view. And when people do this, I just shake my head. Because I am not ignoring aspects that are unfavorable to my point of view. I actually acknowledge those aspects, and I told you guys, and I tell everybody, what the repercussions of these aspects are. What I find really funny about this is that the skeptic here will charge me with special pleading, even though it's not me who's doing it here. It's the skeptic who's doing it here. I laid out a third option to the aspects that the skeptic will bring here and show that there is a third option, but it's the skeptic who's ignoring aspects that are deliberate. He's deliberately ignoring aspects that are unfavorable to his point of view by ignoring the third option I present. If the skeptic is going to ignore the third option, he is the one who's guilty of special pleading, not me.
Well. How the turntables...
It's also worth noting here that the Euthyphro Dilemma came up from a person who was talking about humanoid, finite, and created gods. These were gods that made love with humans in mythology and had a beginning and an end and would die and would be given birth. Not a monotheistic, eternal God who is the sole harbinger of reality and truth itself. So we covered a lot of points here, but this is a long way of saying that the Euthyphro Dilemma isn't actually a dilemma, and that God himself is the standard of good, which eliminates the dilemma, nullifying this objection. So the next one is going to be a fun one. There's going to be a lot of subtopics here that we haven't talked about before, at least within this channel. And for any atheists listening here, keep in mind that I'm talking about a specific type of atheist who may not be in line with your type of atheism, just because atheism has so many different branches to it. So here's the objection. Morality is objectively based off of science and evolution. This view of objective morality was made pretty famous by somebody named Sam Harris, who wrote the book The Moral Landscape. So I'm going to use Sam Harris specifically here as a position to counter and also attack as well. The reason why is because his view is the reigning view of objective morality based on science and evolution. So first part of all of this is that natural science tells us what is, not what ought to be. What I mean by that is it's describing things that are, but it's not describing the way things should be. An atheist philosopher named Jerry Fodor says, science is about facts, not norms. It might tell us how we are, but it wouldn't tell us what is wrong with how we are. In particular, it cannot tell us we have a moral obligation to take actions that are conducive to human flourishing. The point being here is that, first of all, science can't prescribe morality. It cannot prescribe objective moral actions because it can only describe things. Secondly, remember, I showed many examples of atheist philosophers that rejected objective morality. People like Sam Harris try to have their cake and eat it too. In naturalism, it's the view that there is no God and nature is all there is. Sam Harris is a naturalist. He also correctly affirms something called determinism. If you don't know what that is, determinism is the philosophical view that all events are determined completely by previously existing causes and by the laws of nature. So under naturalism, most philosophers agree that determinism is inescapable. It is by far and wide the most accepted naturalistic worldview. Under determinism, there are two very fatal daggers in relation to morality. One is that determinism negates free will because our choices are not actual choices, because everything isn't determined by our conscious rational thought, but again by previous causes and the laws of nature. Which leads to the next dagger. Under this reality, we have no free will, and our thoughts and choices are nothing but the result of chemical reactions, and we are exempt from moral responsibility at that point. Remember, ought implies can. And what I mean by that is when I say you ought not murder somebody, it also implies that you can murder somebody. Remember that whenever morality is in question, a choice is required. The word ought implies can. If you can't make a choice, though, because everything is predetermined, then you can't be held morally responsible. If you're not in charge of your own conscious thought, why would you be held responsible for something that you are going to do no matter what happens? For example, if somebody shoves you into another person, you are not to blame for bumping into this person. You had no choice. But Harris believes that all of our actions are causally determined and there's no free will. So it's extremely clear here that those that want to place the foundation of objective morality into the natural world are really just shooting themselves in the foot. Those are only two areas where Sam Harris falls short. Here's the next one. On atheism, there is no reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than an insect well-being or rat well-being or hyena well-being. This is what Harris calls the value problem, which is what he attempts to solve by grounding objective moral values in nature. So how does Sam Harris propose to solve this value problem? His trick is to simply redefine what he means by good and evil in non-moral terms. He says we should define good as that which supports the well-being of conscious creatures. He states, good and evil need only consist in this, misery versus well-being. Or again, in speaking of moral truth, I am saying that there must be facts regarding human and animal well-being. The problem here is that he's just simply redefining good to fit his own narrative. And even then, it's still question-begging. Why do we strive for well-being? Like, why is well-being good? Someone might answer, well, because it's good. To which I'll ask, well, why is it good? To which they'll reply, because it maximizes well-being. It's just circular reasoning at that point. And you can continually ask why when it comes to their grounding of the objective morality and why they don't have anything other than this. At the end of the day, you can keep probing and asking the why question under the naturalist moral realism worldview, and you won't have a reason. At the end of the day, Harris is not really talking about moral values. He's just talking about what's conducive to the flourishing of sentient life on this planet. And seen in this light, his claim that science can tell us about what contributes to human flourishing isn't controversial at all. I mean, of course it can. Just as it can tell us what's conducive to flourishing of corn and mosquitoes and bacteria, his so-called moral landscape, picturing the highs and lows of human flourishing, is not a moral landscape at all. It's better off as titled the propagation of genes landscape. The best part of all this is that Sam Harris even admits all of this in his book, and he refutes himself. There's more I could dig into on this, but I feel like this is sufficient enough to say that morality is obviously not grounded from nature. So those are the biggest two that I and many other Christian philosophers will get on a regular basis. They're good objections when you first look at them, and they're difficult to work through sometimes, but ultimately we're able to cut right through them. Let's go through some other objections now that are a little bit more common, a little easier to work through, and sometimes they're just made out of ignorance of what the point of the argument is. So for instance, you don't have to believe in God to be moral. Most people will make this objection strictly just because Christians and atheists alike will use this argument in the wrong way and misinterpret it. So to the objector that says this, we're in agreement, but that doesn't undercut the argument at all. Remember that this argument says nothing about what you believe in relation to morality. Nobody that uses this argument in the way it's supposed to be used says you need to believe in God to be moral. The argument deals with grounding or foundation of objective morality. It says that if God does not exist, then there can be no basis of objective morality. So yes, atheists can be moral. I know several atheists who are more moral than some Christians. The issue of belief has nothing to do with the argument. The argument simply highlights the fact that there must be a basis, some kind of standard that is outside of ourselves in order for there to be objective morality. This objection makes a category error of confusing a question of moral ontology, is there a moral reality, with a more epistemological question of how do we come to know or believe in the moral reality. The arguments from the first premise, again, are not explaining what you need to believe in relation to morality. The argument in the first premise is explaining two different systems or potential realities, one where God exists and morality is objective, and one where God does not exist and morality is an illusory subjective opinion. So we can see that this objection doesn't work, as it's just a general misunderstanding of what the argument says. Next one. If morality is objective, then why do some cultures practice female genital mutilation, cannibalism, infanticide, and other atrocities which we in the West deem unacceptable? So there's two responses that I'm going to give here. One is that even though not all cultures share the exact same moral facts, most embrace the same underlying moral values. For example, there are certain tribes that practice cenocide, the authorized killing of the elderly, due to their belief that everyone in the afterlife will continue living in the same body they died with. In order to ensure that those in the afterlife are capable of hunting, swimming, and building houses, the elderly are killed before they become too old to take care of themselves. This act is done with the well-being of the elderly in mind. The moral value that we hold in the West is the elderly are valuable and must be taken care of. And these tribes that do cenocide, for instance, share that same value. Notice that it's not murder in their eyes. Murder, again, is the unjustified taking of a human life. They realize the elderly here are humans. The act of taking their life, though, is justified in their eyes because they're doing it for their own good based off their beliefs in their afterlife. The second response is that some cultures do, in fact, practice certain things that are just straight up horrendous. Cultures that practice infanticide, female circumcision, child prostitution, and much more are practicing acts that are repulsive and morally abhorrent. When a man decides that his 6-year-old daughter needs to be circumcised or sold into prostitution, that is not a cultural or traditional difference that we should respect and uphold. Rather, these are atrocities that need to be advocated against and ended. I'm sure most people would agree with that. The existence of multiple moral codes, though, does not negate the existence of objective morality. Remember, this is not a question of how we know these certain morals. It's a question of whether or not they exist. It's a question of ontology, not epistemology. Are we to condone slavery and segregation since they were once allowed under our country's moral code? Of course not. We condemn those actions, and rightly so, because we know they're objectively wrong. And even if we didn't know they're objectively wrong, they would still be objectively wrong. Take the example of Nazi Germany. The Nazi ideology consented to the slaughter of millions, but their actions were wrong despite them thinking that they were right. Tim Keller, a Christian pastor, summarizes this point pretty well. The Nazis who exterminated the Jews may have claimed that they didn't feel it was immoral at all. We don't care. We don't care if they sincerely felt they were doing a service to humanity. They ought not have done it. We do not only have moral feelings, but we also have an ineradicable belief that moral standards exist outside of us, by which our internal moral feelings are evaluated, simply because the society practices acts that are contrary to what is moral does not mean that all moral codes are equal. Moral disagreements do not nullify moral truths. If they did, they would also nullify the objectivity of mathematics and other abstract phenomena we experience. The point here being, cultural differences have no bearing on the ontological existence of morality. Like Tim Keller said, and I expounded on, if it did, then the same logic can be used to discount the objective laws of mathematics. The reigning view within mathematicians is that we discovered objective mathematical law, just like I'm arguing that we discover objective moral law. So, if people want to disagree on objective mathematical law, all of a sudden, that logic is used to discount objective mathematical law. That's why this doesn't work in terms of objective morality. You can't discount objective morality on the grounds that people disagree on what is objectively moral and what isn't. Next objection is a question to objective morality. So it goes, but what if you needed to lie in order to save someone's life? It seems that morality is not absolute as you say it is. So I covered this in my objective morality video, but it's worth going over again. We're not talking about absolute morality here. There's a difference between absolute and objective. Absolutism requires that something will or must always be the case. Objectivity simply means independent and judgment independent, meaning independent of our personal thoughts and opinions. So when I argue for objective morality, I'm not arguing that it's always the case that lying is wrong. For instance, the moral argument doesn't defend absolute morality. Rather, it contends that there is a standard of morality that transcends humans' opinions, judgments, and biases. Let's suppose that some nation today decreed that every one of its homosexual citizens would be tortured to death simply for being homosexual. It would still be the case that it's wrong to torture homosexuals to death for simply being homosexual. The statement, it is wrong to torture homosexuals to death simply for being homosexual, is true, regardless of whether or not anyone believes it to be true. This is what I meant by objective. If you watched the last video, I covered something called graded absolutism or moral hierarchies. This is a form of hierarchy in which certain objective moral obligations outweigh others under certain conditions. For example, you have a higher moral obligation to protect one's life than a moral duty to tell the truth to somebody trying to murder that person. So we can see that this objection doesn't really stand. This next one is one of my favorites. You have no evidence for objective morality, and I won't believe in anything unless I have evidence for it. In that case, you shouldn't even believe that I exist. You shouldn't even believe you have a body. You shouldn't believe that the external world around you is actually there. After all, how do you know that you're not a brain in a vat being electrically stimulated by a scientist who wants you to think that all of this is real? You could be in the Matrix for all you know. How do you know that you weren't created a couple minutes ago and implanted with memories of your past life? How could you possibly prove otherwise? The only way you could prove that you're not a brain in a vat being controlled by a scientist is by exiting your own existence, which is impossible. This is the problem with hyperskepticism and empiricism. Empiricism being that truth is only knowable through scientific evidence and experience. These are self-defeating stances. They use philosophical statements to say something can't be true apart from evidence, but then what they're saying can't be true because they're using philosophical statements that aren't used in line with evidence. So what I mean by that is empiricism says that truth can't be known apart from science, but it uses a philosophical, non-scientific statement to make its claim. So therefore, that statement and claim can't be true because it's not a scientific fact. Do you see the problem there? So where am I going with this? Denying the existence of something on the basis of I will not believe unless I have evidence for it leaves you with something that philosophers call solipsism. Solipsism is the view or theory that the self is all that can be known to exist. What I mean by that, again, is all you can really know to exist under these views is that your thoughts, the mind is all that can possibly exist or be known to exist because you can't prove otherwise. We believe in the reality of the external world on the basis of our experience with the external world. And we are justified in believing that the external world is real unless they have good evidence to suggest otherwise. There is no way to prove, empirically or otherwise, that the external world is real, or that the past wasn't created 2 minutes ago with the appearance of age, and yet we all believe these to be true, and we're justified in doing so. In the absence of defeating evidence against objective morality, we're justified in trusting our experience to the external world. In the same way, I think we know objective morality exists on the basis of our moral experience. We have access to moral facts about the universe through our moral intuition. Unless we have good reason to distrust our moral experience, we are justified in accepting the reality of the objective moral framework that it presents us with. If that one went over your heads a little bit, let me know. I tried to break it down as much as I could. Let me know in the comments, please. The next objection. God carried out immoral acts in the Bible. So first off, this isn't really an objection to the moral argument, because remember, if you want to attack the argument, you have to attack the premises. It doesn't attack any of the premises, so it's irrelevant to the argument itself. But I think it's worth diving into, strictly on the basis that it actually plays into my point. By making a judgment on God's actions and deeming them immoral, the objector is appealing to a standard of morality that holds true outside of himself. By doing this, he affirms the existence of objective morality. But if the skeptic wants to affirm objective morality after throwing God out the window, then there needs to be an alternate explanation for his basis of claiming that God's action was immoral. If not God, then what is it? The burden is now on the skeptic to provide a naturalistic explanation for the objective moral framework, which you won't be able to do.
Well, well, well. How the turntables...
And that's it, guys. Those are the objections to the moral argument, the top objections, and then some of the fun ones. If you like this video, like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments, please. And I really appreciate all your guys' support. You guys are amazing. The next video series, since this is the end of the moral argument series, is going to be something called the Why series. And the reason I'm deciding to do this is because I wanted to take a little bit of a break from philosophical arguments. And I wanted just to dive into answering questions that people have about Christianity. And there's a tons of questions, right? And I think the why questions are really important. So an example of a why question that I aim to answer is, why did God have to sacrifice Jesus on the cross to forgive us? Couldn't he have just forgiven us? That's an example of one, and there's many more that I aim to answer. If you have any why questions about the Christian faith, let me know in the comments or reach out to me on Twitter or whatever it might be, and I want to answer them for you guys. Again, guys, I really appreciate you listening, all your support, all the love you've given me. Until next time, talk to you guys later.